I'm delighted this evening to be welcoming Mami Kataoka, who's going to talk to us about contemporary art in Japan. We've had a long and marvelous relationship with the Canadian Art Foundation series of lectures that's gone back at least 12 years, and this is a continuation of that. So we're presenting tonight also in collaboration, in partnership with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, so Canadian Art Foundation and Asian Pacific Foundation of Canada. I would like to invite Christine Shaw, who's the Program and Outreach Manager for the Canadian Art Foundation, to say a few words before we begin. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. We're absolutely delighted to be here with you tonight to present the fourth lecture in the Asia Contemporary Speaker Series. The series is presented, as Gillian mentioned, within the joint context of the Canadian Art Foundation's International Speaker Series and the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada's National Conversation on Asia. It has been a collaboration of forces, a unique partnership that has enabled each of our organizations to engage in a broad and inclusive discussion on what Asia means to Canada today. The Asia Contemporary Speaker Series is designed to explore the dynamic growth and change underway in Asia and the rise of Asia on the international art scene. In order to understand this phenomenon and its connection to global movements of economic and political power, we are presenting or have presented 5 recognized leaders in the field to speak in cities across Canada. Vishaka Desai, who is the Senior Advisor for Global Policy Programs at the Guggenheim Foundation, gave the inaugural lecture to our series here at the AGO in November of 2012. And that was followed by a lecture by Jane de Beauvois, who is the chair of the Asia Art Archive, and she presented a lecture in January at the Musée d'Art Contemporain Montreal. And just this Monday in Vancouver, we presented Philip Tenari, who's the director for the Ullin Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing. So tonight, we are delighted to welcome Mami Kataoka from the Mori Art Museum to present our fourth lecture. The series will conclude in Calgary on April 18th in Calgary at the Glenbow Art Museum, where we'll have Zhang Shengsheng speaking about his work in terms of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and he is the managing editor of Yishu, the Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art. So our desire with this series is to generate a transnational dialogue, and so therefore we welcome you and encourage you to visit canadianart.ca to view documentation of the previous lectures, and within the next couple of weeks we'll have the current lectures available for you to view and to take part in, or at least engage in, this national dialogue that we've been supporting. The Canadian Art Foundation gratefully acknowledges the BMO Financial Group for its continued support of our International Speaker Series, without whom we could not engage in such important partnerships. We especially want to thank Nada Ristich, the Director of Corporate Donations, who is here with us tonight. Nada, yes. She's familiar to many. Nada has championed the partnership between the Canadian Art Foundation and the Asia Pacific Foundation, and we thank you for this. We'd also like to thank the Art Gallery of Ontario for collaborating with us to present tonight's lecture, which fortuitously is a precursor to Mami's return in August, when she will present her exhibition Ai Weiwei, According to What? Toronto eagerly anticipates this exhibition. And finally, I'd like to thank and introduce you to Hank Bull, artist, curator, and senior research fellow for arts and culture with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. It is Hank who is the curatorial force behind this series. So we welcome Hank.
It's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm going to just indulge in a little memory lane here. I had some of my formative art experiences in this building when I was growing up. And I remember the walls. The walls back in the day in the original building were covered in heavy burlap that had been painted, infinitely by white paint. They were an installation in themselves. And I remember at the tender age of 12 and 13 seeing major survey exhibitions of Picasso, Mondrian, Van Gogh, the Sunflowers, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, Broadway Boogie Woogie. They were all here. It was incredible as a kid to see this stuff. And then later on, when I was a student at the New School of Art, I saw another life-changing exhibition, Michael Snow, A Survey, 1970. So, I'm slightly amazed, in fact, to find myself here in front of you tonight, and very happy to be here. It's true that this has been an extremely happy collaboration, this series, and Mami Kataoka, we're thrilled to have you with us tonight, Mami, and we really couldn't have a better person for the national conversation on Asia because of her experience not only in Japan, but working in China, working with artists from the broad Asian area, and not only presenting them in Asia, but presenting these artists in the West. She's really ideally positioned to talk about the rapidly changing relationships between Korea, Japan, Taiwan, China, Southeast Asia, and we can add to that Canada, you know, and this is really the reason behind the conversation on Asia, is that we're reading every day in the paper, it was on the front page again today, about oil pipelines, and we're reading about immigration. But really, in order to understand where we are with this, who we are, and where these massive historical changes are taking us, we really need the nuanced and complex questions that are asked by contemporary artists. And so really trying to give this a kind of human dimension is what we're talking about here. And so just a couple words about Mami Kataoka. She was the chief curator at the Tokyo Opera City Art Gallery in the late 90s. And there she produced important exhibitions by Tatsue Mitsushima and Miyajima, and Rikrit Tiravanija, two artists who have become extremely important internationally. And now, for the last 10 years, she's been the chief curator at the Mori Art Gallery. She was the curator from the opening of the Mori Museum, which is right in the center of Tokyo, in the Mori Tower, an incredible architectural complex in Roppongi, and it's one of Japan's most preeminent spaces for contemporary art. She's done a lot of projects there. I can't really describe them all, but just a couple to give you an idea. An exhibition called Follow Me in 2005, which featured the work of 19 contemporary artists emerging at that time in China. Li Bu, From Me Belongs to You Only, the first major exhibition by this important Korean woman artist. And then a series of smaller projects, the MAM projects, which feature emerging artists not only from Asia, but from all over the world. Artists from Finland, from France, from Indonesia. And then beyond the walls of the Mori, she produced a very important exhibition for Hiroshi Sugimoto called The End of Time for the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. Tokyo, Berlin, in collaboration with the Neue National Gallery in Berlin. From 2007 to 2009, she was a curator at the Hayward in London as their first international curator. And just last year, she produced a large show for the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco called Phantoms of Asia, which juxtaposed contemporary works with classical works in that museum. And she was the co-artistic director of the Gwangju Biennale in Korea. And of course, we look forward to seeing her back in Toronto very soon, because she's the curator of the major Weiwei exhibition, According to What, which will open here in the summer. Her subject tonight is Contemporary Art in Japan, Visions and Views of the Universe. Would you please join me in welcoming Mami Kataoka?
It is my great honor, really, to be able to share some of my thoughts with the audience in Toronto. Probably the most recent big news from Japan threatened the world was the great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, followed by the Fukushima nuclear disaster, which we have just marked 2 years earlier this year on March 11th. And arguably, I could say that this was the third major social changes in modern history of Japan after Meiji restoration in 1868 onwards, and the end of the World War II from 1945. This incident impacted tremendously the psychology of people in Japan who had been sharing great uncertainty and anxiety for the future of the country even before it happened. At the same time, it provided significant opportunity to be more aware of the position of Japan, including modern history of the country, political relationship with neighboring countries and the regions, as well as the meaning of the civilizations and Western modernism. And many artists and people in creative industries felt so helpless and useless in terms of their professional contribution to the fact. And it also gave a rise to the very strong social consciousness and questions for the essential role and the meaning of art making. 2 years later, while the country seems to be, from just outside, it seems to be functioning under control, Fukushima is to be solved, and the social awareness of the general public is still very, very high. So having in mind, in my lecture today, I would like to look at some of the elements and struggles in early modernism time in Japan and the post-war, before going to look at the contemporary time. And at the end of the lecture, I would like to see the idea of Asia from much broader view. I must say that the position of Japan in Asia is quite unique or peculiar in many ways. And American political scientist Samuel Huntington pointed out the potential isolation of Japan in 21st century. And what he argued in The Crash of Civilization is, quotes, "With the end of the Cold War, international politics moves out of the Western phase, and its centerpiece becomes the interaction between the West and the non-Western civilizations, and among non-Western civilizations." End of quotes. And about Japan, he pointed out the quotes, "The task of achieving modernization without Westernization has been a central theme of Japan's development since the 1870s. The society that has emerged as a result has reached the pinnacle of modernization while maintaining a truly non-Western quality in its fundamental values, lifestyles, human relationships, and codes of conduct. Japan is a society that is likely to continue to maintain these qualities in the future." End of quotes. In fact, Japan had really gone through its process of modernization throughout 20th century, and now its economy and development of the country is meeting its level off or downhill, which is probably familiar in some of the Western countries as well. At the same time, Japan still belongs to Asia in terms of its geographical location, and it makes the position of Japan very peculiar and ambiguous. In early Meiji period, in the late 19th century, the Meiji government started in 1868. So the late 19th century, which was the threshold of modernization or westernization, there were many arguments. New Meiji government was eager to catch up with Western great powers, having 200-some years of delay due to the Sakoku policy to close the country from abroad with a few exceptions. Japan started to participate in the World Expo, such as 1867 Paris Expo, and more officially in 1873 Vienna Expo as a new government. And so this was the image from Vienna Expo, and then they did kind of a first expo for the internal domestic audience after they returned from the Vienna Expo. The idea of fine art was said to be translated as bijutsu, literally means the beauty and technique, to participate in Vienna Expo. And people like Fukuzawa Yukichi, the author of an outline of the theory of civilization, and also founder of Keio University, was rather promoting enrichment of the country through strength of military. And he was in the strong wind of westernization by the government policy and the society. And he also argues that Japan should really forget the relationship with Asian neighboring countries. And so as we can see, what sort of foreign policy and relationship Japan had had within Asia from the late 19th century to the Second World War. And after Meiji new government started, Japan soon did war with China, and then after that they got Taiwan under Japanese rule. And 1904 to 5, the Russia and Japanese war, and then afterwards they got Korea under Japanese control or rules from 1910 throughout the end of the Second World War. And also for artistically, in terms of the cultural policy, Meiji government also ordered to separate Shinto and Buddhism in 1868, which had been in a state of syncretic fusion since centuries, even since the Buddhism came in 7th and 8th century. It gave tremendous damage to the temples and shrines, as well as its religious artifacts. And meanwhile, young Bostonian scholar Ernest Fenollosa was invited to teach Western philosophy and politics at the Tokyo University in 1878, and who made significant contribution in terms of the appreciation of traditional Japanese art. And he was actually invited by the Edward Morse, who was the zoologist. And then Fenollosa also invited or influenced William Bigelow to come to Japan and became a very big, important collector for traditional Japanese art. And so they traveled through Japan and collected pre-Meiji artworks and contributed for compiling a law for preservation of traditional art enacted in 1879. And then he returned to US and became a curator at the Boston Fine Art Museum. Okakura Kakuzo, also known as Okakura Tenshin, first served as a translator for Fenollosa when he was a government officer. And he's the author of The Ideals of the East and Awakening of Japan and the Book of Tea, all written in English at around that time. And later he also served as a curator of Fine Art Museum from 1904 to 1913 until his early death. And first I was interested in him because I read that he was on a 6 months contract with the Boston Fine Art Museum. And I was also 6 months contract with the Hayward and the Mori Art Museum when I could fly on an airplane. And how could this man 100 years ago had this very funny contract between the Boston Fine Art Museum, and he was also traveling throughout India and China and doing all this research that I would be doing probably, but now, like in contemporary time. And so I was really fascinated by some of the writing and thoughts that he had around that time. And one of the renowned sentences by Okakura is starting from the sentence called "Asia is one." And this is written in his Ideals of the East and was later considered or misinterpreted as a slogan for Japan's imperialist policy in Asia. But however, arguably, I think the Okakura himself was one of the first Japanese who had an awareness and extended knowledge of Japanese and Asian culture and could translate its artistic values to the West and the rest of the world. And he says the Himalayas divides only to accentuate two mighty civilizations, the Chinese with its communism of Confucius and the Indian with the individualism of the Vedas. but not even the snowy barriers can interpret for one moment that broad expanse of love for the ultimate and universal, which is the common thought inheritance of every Asian race. And which I think there is some validity that we should be looking at in contemporary time. He also invited some Japanese artists to Boston. Now we can call it artists in residence, while sent them to India and connected with the people such as Sir Rabindranath Tagore and others. One of the examples of the struggles among artists at the time can be found in a particular style, which was called Moro Tai. Moro Tai literally means dim or vague style, which was named by the critics with their sort of negative gaze. And under Okakura, artists such as Yokoyama Taikan or Hishida Shunso tried to incorporate ideas of John Constable or Barbizon school while using traditional materials, but not using the fine outline to depict light and space. And we can see the struggles among artists within multiple currents of Western paintings and sculptures or traditional paintings, as well as the traditional craft and how to deal with the calligraphy. So you can see some of the school in Tokyo University of Art. These are the school of the Japanese painting, which they're sitting and having these silk cloth and a flat. And this is a Western style painting school or class, which you are having all these standing easel to paint this naked model. And so we can keep this in mind, how people are struggling two paths already. But while in 1920s and 30s, many artists visited and studied in Europe and brought back the ideas of futurism, Dadaism, and many other contemporary thoughts, and later reached to the flourish of modernism. And that studies of modernism were blocked by the World War II. So now I have to jump to the time of post-war and second major social and political changes in Japan after Meiji Restoration. From 1945 to 1952, Japan was under the supreme commander for the Allied powers. And in 1952, under the Treaty of San Francisco, Japan got its independence back, but still together with the security treaty between the United States and Japan. And as an immediate reaction to the defeat of the war, we can see some works depicting struggles and the recovery process, while some of the artists were already seeking for the playback of a modernism movement in 1930s. One of the places where avant-garde artists met was a library under GHQ called Civil Information Education section, where they can learn Western movements and hearing records from the US. And early examples of interdisciplinary art movements came out of this place, which is called the experimental workshop, and jiken kobo, we call it in Japanese. And it started in 1951 and continued until 1957, which included many important musicians and artists such as Toru Takemitsu, Toshi Ichiyanagi, and Katsuhiro Yamaguchi, amongst others. And this is the group shot of their group. And this is very young Takemitsu and Hideko Fukushima. And this was a very early example. And they were active, mostly based in Tokyo area, while the Gutai, which you can see the retrospective now at the Guggenheim Museum, is from 1952, around the same time, but more centered in Kobe or southern area. And meanwhile, there was another current of artists who seeks for the new realism in 1950s. And even after the Treaty of San Francisco, due to the security treaty between the United States and Japan. In short, in Japanese, they call it AMPO. And there was a very good film about AMPO, actually. And there were new issues around U.S. military bases under the Cold War condition. And also there was a Korean War between 1950 and 53. So Japan again became an important military base for U.S. government in the 50s. So the artists who are doing this sort of painting, they were called reportage painters, or reportage paintings. And they depicted various political and social issues, still very much in live around that time. And so these are some of the examples by Ikeda Tatsuo. It says 10,000 count. And because of the nuclear test in the Pacific Ocean, that all these fishermen had influence for their sort of fishery business. So now a lot of Japanese people have a Geiger counter at home, and but at that time, there also these fishermen were having the Geiger counter in 1950s, and then also some of the fishermen's village was damaged by the military base. And so these are some of the examples. And then also there were a lot of struggles for having these U.S. based, and some of the farmers had to give up their farming land. So some of the cases lasting for like 15 or 20 years. And artists like Nakamura Hiroshi was also aware of these incidents, and then they were painting these incidents in their reportage paintings. This is also by Nakamura Hiroshi. It's called The Island, but it's really about the Okinawa Island. Now we still have this very long history of struggle between U.S. and U.S.-based and Japan. And in 1956, government already declared it's not post-war anymore from their economic point of view. And in 1959, hosting of 1964 Olympic in Tokyo was determined. And 1970, Japan hosted Osaka Expo. In fact, there was a plan to have, this was from 1964 Tokyo Olympic. And this is a poster for 1970 Osaka Expo. But this is actually the poster for Expo in 1940, which was planned also to have an Olympic around at the same year, but it got cancelled due to the China-Japan war at that time. But anyway, Japan went through rapid economic growth from the mid-50s to 70s, which was even called post-war economic miracle. And in a way, it continued until the end of 1980s, when bubble economy had burst at the very, very end of the 1980s. Throughout the 60s, there were a number of avant-garde groups emerged from various regions, including Hayward Center, Neo-Dada organizers, and group Kyushu and Zero Jigen in Nagoya. And also, around the same time, or late 60s, new sculpture tendencies later called Monoha, had emerged from Tokyo, while it literally means the school of things, as the feature of their practice is to use natural materials such as stone, soil, wood, and other raw industrial materials such as steel plate, concrete, and glass. And their consciousness was more expanded to the relationship between the object, space, and even with the audience. So these are some of the Monoha examples by Suga Kishio, and who had a beautiful show in Los Angeles last year, or early this year. And Li Wufan is also a very important artist from Monoha who sort of theoreticized the idea of Monoha and then had a retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum a few years ago. So now, in 1989, the world marked the end of the Cold War, when the 1989, the end of the Cold War, but also for Japan, it means the end of the bubble economy and then beginning of the 2 decades of, we call it lost decades, which is being expanded for 2 decades. And during this time, the presence of Japanese contemporary art was visible through only probably the handful group exhibitions in the US, such as the 1904 Scream Against the Sky was at the Guggenheim Soho, curated by Alexandra Monroe. And some other example of the exhibitions is called Against Nature, Japanese Art in the 80s. This traveled 7 to 8 museums in the US from 89 to 90. And then also a sculpture exhibition called A Primal Spirit, 10 contemporary Japanese sculptors, which included kind of the line of Monoha, but more in the younger generation at the time. And the artist we saw, or you could probably recognize, is, of course, artists like Takashi Murakami and Yayoi Kusama, Hiroshi Sugimoto, and Yoshitomo Nara, all these very handful individuals who are kind of supporting the presence of Japanese art, but not as a whole, because the attention or presence of the sort of national art was more for the Chinese and the Indian, and now towards the Southeast Asians. And it was also a result of world attention to emerging Asian countries, such as those countries I mentioned. And while there had been many complex social issues within Japan, due to its long-term state of peace and economic growth, followed by its rather slow and quiet encroachment, young artists found it very difficult to really face to the broader global issues and positioning of the society for a long time. And now, going back to the beginning of the lecture, the society after 3/11 in 2011 is arguably the third major change of the nation after Meiji restoration and the post-war. Also, I think the emergence of generation who were born in late 70s to early 80s is showing different views towards the post-war history and the war itself, which wasn't really talked about or even sort of taught in school. So some of the generation, including my generation, really lack the sense of history, pre-war and during the war and early post-war. Probably, I think the country was really trying to forget about defeat of the war and only to sort of look front and try to sort of recover from the sort of lost feeling. And so it's been too long not to really talked about or looking at the war. So the new generation artist, for instance, Shitamichi Motoyuki, and he was born in 1979, and he was doing a research on these bunkers and some of the structures that they had been built during the war, and now being used in a completely different way. So like these photographs, at the back of the photograph, you see they are using this place as the place as a sort of new farming place or like a farming field, or this can be used as a farmer's storage. And so he collected all these, the new meaning or new usage of forgotten structure from the war. But also he's responding to the 3/11, and he traveled throughout the nation with his little motorbike and collected these images of the sort of temporary bridges that the people made it out of the necessity. But this is for him to consider the connection, how to make these connection of the things that were sort of divided. And also artists such as Teruya Yuken, who is from Okinawa, and he had been very aware of condition of Okinawa for a long time, but he had been very sort of sensitively reacting to those movements. And for 3/11, he said he did do what I can do. So he just cut out all these newspapers from the disaster, reporting the disasters, and he is just cutting out all these plants as a new life coming out of the incident. And then also Koizumi Meiro, born in 1976, who is now showing his work at the project space in the Museum of Modern Art, New York. And he's very good at sort of engraving the people's deep emotion throughout his video work. And a piece called A Portrait of a Young Samurai. And he's hiring this young actor who is supposed to be zero fighter. And so he made this young actor saying again and again, express more sort of samurai spirit, saying sort of goodbye to his parents. And because the Meiro asked him to do it much more like realistically again and again, and he really becomes bringing out the deep emotion from bottom of his heart. And one another example by him is called It's a Comedy, but it's about the judge or jury Pal. He was an Indian jury for the Japan's the court case for the war criminal, and he was only one person who said nobody should be guilty. And so he was remembered as the very important jury. But Meiro asked this man to read all these announcements from the court. But the second person behind him is always sort of disturbing by playing around from the back. But this man has to keep the quiet and calm face. So it was such a struggle between the emotion and his responsibility. And then also the other group called Chimpom, who is kind of like naughty young groups that they were considered. But it's very interesting because one of the provocative projects that they did in Hiroshima is making a sky of Hiroshima Pika, and you see these airplane crowds that they made, hiring this airplane. And Pika is the sound of light, and so people from Hiroshima calls the bomb, like nuclear bomb, as a Pika because the light was so strong that people remembered that light. And so it was such a sort of scandal among all these citizens in Hiroshima because it still really touches the very hard memory of the people in Hiroshima. And then also they added a part on this famous mural by Taro Okamoto, who painted this huge mural for one of the places in Brazil, and it came back to Japan recently, and now being stored or shown at Shibuya Station. And this was about against the nuclear test and nuclear power, and then also warning for the sort of apocalyptic state of the society. And they add little part here by adding some of the scene of the explosion of the nuclear power plant in Fukushima. And then they were taken by the police and had to stay for a couple of days. And also women artist Kazama Sachiko, who is doing this very serious social research about the history of politics in Japan, between Japan and United States, and who really started the project of developing nuclear power plants and a new energy policy. And then also, this is called the Mark I, is a type of nuclear power plant that exploded in Fukushima that some of the specialists knew how dangerous that the type of the plants were. And so she makes this monoprint. So it's wood carve print, but woodcut print, but only print for once. So these are some of the examples that who became more conscious about the political, social conditions. And then also 311 made people aware of the traditional perception of nature since centuries and understanding of the idea of impermanence and constant changes due to the aging climate. And yeah, I could have another talk around this subject, but just wanted to make a connection with 1960 Monoha, like a Suga Kishu I showed previously, that because of the name Monoha, it's called the school of things. People only considered, or more sort of considers the movement as the movement about the material itself. But they're more conscious about the things and then also the space around it. So how, for instance, by adding one piece of wood at the corner of the window and what kind of new energy that will create around that corner or space around that things. So it relates to the this traditional understanding or concept of the nature and the invisible energies. And some other example that we can see is Chiharu Shiota, who lives in Berlin for some years now, and she was born in 1972. But this is a piece called The Silence, and it comes from her memory of there was a fire in her neighborhood when she was a child, and but she depicts these sort of silence or kind of negative energy around those memories, and this is the actual black thread that she connects around and fill the space. And it's really amazing installation that she does. And sometimes she combines the installation with the performance, so let people stay in the bed, and you can recall her nightmares and something that happens during the darkness, and she represents that kind of darkness or negative energy with this black thread. And then on also young artist, or the 1978 born Kaneuji Teppei, and who uses this plastic or daily object, but by pouring some powder sugar or plaster over it to deform or make the form disappear and then having a new form. Or this very interesting artist born in 1980, Mitsuda Haruo, who makes this real-size insects. It's really like the metal realism, but it comes from the early Meiji period, when all these metalsmiths during the samurai period, they lost their job after the Meiji period because there is no need for sword and the cover of the sword and all this decoration that they used to do. So they wanted to use this technique for other means. And then there was a time that this insects called Jizai Okimono was very popular early Meiji period. And this young artist, Mitsuda Haruo, really wanted to investigate what they did, and that he brought the idea further to more extremely realistic artworks. This really moves, like all parts, all jointly moves around. And then also we can look at those movements and then also performative practices which had been very important in the last few years or maybe like 5 years in the global art movement. So artists like Sasamoto Aki, who performs and then also makes some installations, and while she's talking, and she studied mathematics and then also interested in all these movements of energy and how she could relate to the whole of energy of the universe. And also I recently met Japanese descent artist Mika Tajima, and she was born in LA and lives in New York now. But she can also relate to the idea of modernism, movements, and fashion, and different disciplines that she works around. And also New York-based Japanese artist A. Arakawa, who had been having some performance at the Museum of Modern Art as well. And he had been also in between performance and painting, and some of the relationship that he makes with the audience. So there had been a lot of diverse changes and then also new awareness among Japanese young generation, which I'm really hoping that we could contextualize them much in detail so that they found their position. And before I close the talk, I would also return to the sentence by Okakura, Asia is one, which I'm still very intrigued by. And Great Tohoku earthquake reminded the greater power of nature and the whole of universe, which Fukushima disaster reinforced the awareness further towards the suspicions on the economy-driven energy policy and limitation of the science and the safety myth on nuclear power. And many of us today are realizing the end of the progressive value in this ever-complex world condition. And having looked at the complexities and ambiguity of Japanese society since early Meiji, which was modernized but not totally westernized, one could raise the questions on the validity of ancient Eastern philosophy for contemporary society. I had been interested in considering Japan's ambiguity between East and West, applying on the Chinese philosophy of yin and yang, instead of considering everything based on the dichotomy or dualism. Yin and yang suggests the state of equilibrium between two opposite or contrary forces, and its formula is ever-changing and never remain the same. And this idea can be applied to further towards Ushin, or 5 elements, or idea of I Ching, or chakra in yoga, or feng shui, all of which gives an awareness of invisible forces and celestial realms, or the importance of equilibrium. So this is the idea of Ushin, that all these 5 elements which compose the all of universe: fire, earth, metal, water, and wood. And for instance, wood creates fire, fire creates earth, earth creates metal, but some of them destroy each other. But all of these elements has to balance on a sort of a horizontal level. It's not a hierarchical idea which is better than the other. It all needs to sort of find a way to coexist together. And then also I like this idea of Handon. It's about the idea of chaos by John G. And this is a story about a different emperor from different regions. And the emperor of Handon was in between two empires, and he was helping to connect these the emperor of Shu and Hu, because he was so nice to those northern emperor and southern emperor, and these 2 emperors tried to help him because this Handon, or chaos, didn't have any holes like mouth and nose and ears, and so they tried to give him some holes to try to give him some understanding. So every day they gave him a new holes. At the 7th day, the chaos or Handon passed away. So it really tells the idea of logical thinking or rational thinking is not always the good thing. And it's important to keep it as a chaos and not try to sort of categorize or articulate it everything. It also relates to the very much of the Asian idea. and idea of impermanence. And also, I like the idea of, it really starts from a Brahmanism in the ancient India, that Brahman is the origin of entire larger universe, and Atman is your inner self. And your inner self, Atman, is connected with Brahman, larger macrocosmos. And in Jainism, they have beautiful paintings, a lot of these kinds, that this is the Brahman as a macrocosmos. And within yourself, there is a microcosmos, and this is always one. So it's the larger sort of cosmological view of how you are part of the larger universe. And in 20th century, in West already, a number of artists and intellects were aware of these sort of invisible forces or idea of void or transient world and its impermanence and its importance, such as Yves Klein, who studied judo in Japan in 50s. And then also people like Joseph Beuys also, he was aware of this idea by having some collaboration with Nam June Paik. And of course, John Cage and Alan Kaplow, who are influenced by Daisetsu Suzuki. And, but also we could go back to the Spinoza or like Rudolf Steiner. There are much to be done in the way to look at this equilibrium of the all of universe. And I feel that there are much to be done to reconsider the way of looking at the universe for the future of the Earth. And it has been a privilege to be able to share some of my thoughts with you this evening. Thank you very much.
So if we could have the house lights up. And I think Mami would be happy to take a few questions.
I just wanted to ask about the sort of Japanese attitude to the artists that we know here in the West, like Murakami and Sugimoto. How does the general public receive them in Japan? And how do cultural institutions relate to them? Thank you.
There are different levels, I think. We had a Meiji Sugimoto retrospective in 2005 at the Mori Art Museum. And actually, until that time, of course, he was known by the general public. But since 2005, he became really very known, famous person in for the general public. And probably Murakami had been more known by the younger generations. And the people knows that he had been having great success. But he had a major solo exhibition, I think it was 2001, at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo. But since then, his activities are more towards the West. And one of his approach or attitudes is how to sort of overcome this difference between East and West, and how to sort of go beyond these kind of East and West dichotomies. But Hiroshi Sugimoto is probably more going to had been looking at the Japanese ancient idea of the nature. And I worked with him a number of times based on this idea. And he uses technique as a photography, but what he depicts is like one of his recent piece shows these depicts the electricity, but it's really how you look at this invisible power. Yeah, like this series. And also the time and something that you don't really see it, but how to sort of visualize whatever you don't see it. And you can really see his appreciation for the idea of Shintoism and how people used to appreciate more and aware of the power of nature and all of the universe. And Kusama, of course, she had been moving around. Her show had been moving around in Europe for many museums. But I think she's more in a sort of beyond beyond certain level, because not only her age, like over 80 years old, but her continuous power to produce some art is really attracting many people beyond culture, generations, and understanding the different languages. So she's very popular, but all of them are very well known, of course, but I think in a different level.
You touched on this a bit earlier, and I'm very curious about it. Were there any artists in post-World War II Japan who reflected at all about the occupation, China and Korea, before and during the war? Was there any art in that?
It's very rare. I must say, it's very rare. And yeah, I didn't mention that part, but during the war, there was sort of a group of artists who painted under the order of the military regime. The group of artists painted the war painting. And it's sort of like a slogan or promotion of the war. And they sort of legitimize the participation of the war. And after the war, those painters who painted those war paintings were considered as, at one moment, considered as a war criminal. And including artists like Leonardo Fujita. And and then he left Japan, and because of this criticism, and there were some arguments. So this whole thing about war painting became a sort of a taboo in Japanese post-war history. Nobody really talked about it. And I didn't know for a long time. And actual painting of like those war paintings were taken by the a lead power by American government. So they kept those paintings and returned them on the 153 paintings were returned to Japan as a condition of permanent loan only in 1970. And then the Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo kept those paintings and did some conservation and everything. Then just recently they slowly starting to show. And this is also quite recent that people started to talk about the existence of those paintings. And one of the younger generation artists, Makoto Aida, who now actually I'm showing his solo exhibition at the museum. He have a series called War Painting Returns, and he started it in mid-90s. And this was sort of a sensation that he was dealing with the relationship between Japan and Korea, and then also this piece is about the Southeast Asian countries that Japan colonized, or tried to sort of colonize. And now it's being just a southern resort for leisure. So he collected all these traveling leaflets where it used to be sort of war site, but now just being a sort of resort places. And so when museum showed this series in 2000, they couldn't still show properly. So they showed front side towards facing to the wall. And then having some like 1 meter gap. So if you really wanted to see it, you have to see it from like that, like sneaking scene like this. So we're showing this now at the Mori Art Museum. This is really the first time to show entire series of this painting. So it has been that sensitive. And still, as you know, that the relationship between China and Japan and Korea is still very sensitive, because partly, I think, is a lack of our understanding of the history and education of the pre-war and post-war. And so I think it's been a major issue for Japanese to consider where we will be as a position of Japan in the 21st century, geographically within Asia, and where we could situate ourselves is really relating to how we can consider our past and the present, and then also the future.
I was wondering actually if you could say a little bit more either about Ida Makoto or some of the other images you showed and the reaction. I think it's fabulous that we're seeing artists now producing reflective kind of work on the war, but I'm interested also in the reaction. I know that Ida Makoto's show right now has had a lot of strong reaction to other images, but has there been any reaction to his War Pictures Return series?
I was assuming that we would also have this argument on this war painting series, but there is nothing on this series. And we have more compliance on his sexually explicit images. And his those series, it's unfortunately I don't have those images now, but it's so extreme that he was considered as the man of this provocative, very extreme artist. And then also a lot of things that he deals with is relating to Japanese society and politics and everything. So he had been considered as a person who would never really transcend the cultural differences. And so that was my challenge, how artists like him could transcend those cultural boundaries by contextualizing him well, and then also to show the diversity of his work. And I call him as a man of chaos because he has a diverse type of works, and even with this and this. And then also he makes this funny video that he himself is playing a Bin Laden. And is saying that I'm Bin Laden, I'm a really nice person, and I decided to stay in Japan, having sake in hot spring, and don't look for me. Thank you very much. So this is like the funniest video that he made, but it also reveals the psychological distance between Japanese people and the war in Middle East. It's far away from Japan, so you can't really sort of think it's a real story. So he has diverse works. I really wanted to show his diversity and importance of this cosmic view of the world and how he can reflect these so many things happening in the world. But because of all these scandal of sexually explicit, like a child pornography issue and all of these, he's again considered as a man as only about this sexually explicit images. So I'm a little bit unhappy about how he has been dealt, but so many people came to the museum, and nobody who actually saw the show complained. Only people who actually see the little part of his work starting to find a way to complain. So it's interesting that, partly because of this network culture and Twitter culture, you only see the tiny sentence or tiny part of the entire universe. And you really need to see the operation of the larger universe in the broader view. Otherwise, you only point it out and burn the small part.
Nearing the end of the slideshow, you were showing a lot of younger artists who are exploring the ideas of energy and the unknown forces. Do you feel like it is something that is becoming more, is something that is more recent, that people are exploring this concept, or where do you think these ideas are, like where do you think these artists are, is there a reason why they're starting to explore these ideas, or
I think this kind of perception of the invisible energies and something irrational had been there for a long time, but it hasn't really been articulated in that way. And for instance, even the Monoha, who started in late 60s, so it's been like 56 years. And Suga Kishio is one of the artists who kept his attitude since that time. And he said one time he really abandoned this idea of Western philosophy and really studied Indian philosophy and Buddhism and Eastern philosophy. But the major current of understanding or articulating contemporary art was driven by the Western philosophy and Western modernistic idea. So there hasn't really been much of the way to articulate him or artists dealing with this idea articulated from the Eastern point of view. And so I'm not really trying to flip the coin from the Western side to Eastern side. And this is really important, that this yin and yang tells you that both of them are very important. So East and West, or women and men, and all this contrary energy or existence is so important to have an equilibrium, not about hierarchical. So there's some people still think that it might bring our idea to sort of Orientalism or sort of ancient or the classic cliche of East and West. But when the Asia is growing like this economically and then also growing their political power and importance, I think it's really important to understand that how they come from different philosophical background and then also lifestyle and idea and then also different climates. But it's not about the dichotomy either East or West, but I really wanted to sort of find the way to go beyond and see the whole of the universe from like from Mars or something from far away up. Thank you very much.